So land degradation, as we had discussed in last class also, we said land degradation, the simple definition is, or how we classify the land, whether it has got degraded or not, is purely on the basis of one single factor called as the productive capacity. Okay, so this is the single most important criteria used for degradation, whether the land is degraded or not. Based on how much is the fall of productivity, you have three categories: slight degradation or slightly degraded, moderate degradation, and severe degradation. So slight degradation means the crop yield potential is reduced by 10%. Means from 100, it has now become 90. So when it has become 90, you call it as slightly degraded. Moderate degradation, 10 to 50% reduction, which means from 90 to 50. So this becomes your moderate. Am I right? 10 to 50% reduction in yield or potential. So earlier it was 100. Now anywhere between 90 to 50, it is moderate degradation. If it is that is 90, 50, so 40 or below means, sorry, below 50, greater than 50 reduction in potential. So the current potential is less than 50% of the original potential. That is called as severe degradation. And we saw that in the soil erosion or the world degradation atlas also, if you could remember, yeah, very degraded soil. Sometimes these terminologies are kind of interchangeably used. So you can see a lot of black areas. This area here, the very degraded area, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is about land degradation. Now, what are the causes of land degradation? We discussed yesterday also. We said excessive use of agrochemicals, which is both fertilizers and pesticides. Excessive irrigation. Many of you rightly said over irrigation, which results in the phenomena of waterlogging. Cultivation of high yielding varieties of plants. Now you may be thinking, how can cultivation of high yielding varieties of plant lead to degradation? We will look at that in detail. But in addition to these three, if you remember yesterday, we also discussed several other factors. Many of you rightly said salinity of soil, yeah, alkalinity of soil, alkalinity of soil. Then we also talked about a phenomena which I'll discuss in today's class called as frost heaving, which is found in cold weather conditions. Things like mining can cause land degradation because you are pretty much removing the entire forest. Any other factors that we discussed? Soil erosion obviously is anyway there. Soil erosion is definitely there. So you have so many reasons for land degradation. Okay. Deforestation is also a cause of land degradation. So we have multiple factors. If you think about it, all that you have to think is, what if done can reduce the productive yield of the land? Then that is a cause of land degradation, because that's how land degradation is defined: a reduction in the productive yield of the land. That is land degradation. Okay. Now let's look at the three factors which I have kind of discussed here: agrochemicals, these three, yeah, agrochemicals, excessive irrigation, and cultivation of high yielding varieties of plant. So let me look at it this way: use of agrochemicals, excessive irrigation is the second reason. Third is the cultivation of high yielding varieties. Use of agrochemicals, excessive irrigation, and cultivation of high yielding varieties. When we say agrochemicals, so all chemicals that are used in agriculture. So what I do, I divided it into further two parts: excessive use of fertilizers and excessive use of plant protection chemicals. Plant protection chemicals means what? Things like pesticide, herbicide, fungicide. Yeah, there are so many sites, nematocides. Based on the target organism that you're trying to kill, you can have so many types of sites. So use of agrochemicals, we divide it into two categories. One is your fertilizers, other is your plant protection chemicals. Now this brings us to the question, which is the first point: excessive use of fertilizers. Okay, so why do we have to use fertilizers in excess? So let's try to understand the first question. So the first question that we need to discuss is, why fertilizers? Why fertilizers? Now, the answer to this question, why fertilizers, can be understood by understanding the economics behind agriculture. Yeah, we've been doing agriculture for what, more than 2000 years as human beings. But why only in the last 100 years or so the importance of agriculture has increased? Why agriculture? Because we want to increase the productive. We want to increase the productive capacity of the land. Am I right? Am I right? Now tell me one thing. Every land has its own natural capacity. What is that natural capacity called? Means if you don't use any fertilizer, every land can produce something based on its nutrient mix. Okay. It can produce, and let's say if you allow the land to be in that, should I say, in that state, then you will have to cultivate, you will have to, let's say, have a crop. After that, you have to leave the land fallow, yeah, so that it regains it. What is that? What is the term that I'm looking at? If you don't use fertilizer, then the amount of or the quantum of crops that you can use, or the quantum of crops that you can cultivate is limited by fertility. Yes, Prachi, you're right. Fertility, a slightly more broader term than fertility, if you have come across this term, called as the carrying capacity. Yeah, carrying capacity of a land. Okay. Now, what we are trying to do by using fertilizer is that you are trying to artificially. What are you trying to? You're trying to artificially increase the fertility, as Prachi said. You're trying to increase the fertility, or broadly the carrying capacity of the land. We're trying to increase the carrying capacity of the land. Now, is there a problem with it? Let's see what happens when you try to use fertilizers in an excessive manner. Let's try to understand. Okay. So now, let me say this is my soil layer. Okay. I have a crop that is growing like this. Sorry. Yeah. And this is the root. Now the soil has various types of nutrients. Okay, so I'll classify these nutrients as two types. One kind of nutrient is something like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Another kind of nutrient is like copper, zinc, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and all. Now, what do you call? Why have I classified it this way? NPK on one side and copper, zinc, iron, manganese, molybdenum on the other side. Why have I divided them into two categories? The reason why I have divided them into two categories is, yeah, exactly. So one is called as the macronutrients. So the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they are called as the macronutrients. The ones which are there are called as the micronutrients. Why? Because macronutrients are required in higher quantities by the plant. They are required in higher quantity by the plant. Micronutrients are required in lower quantity, are also called as trace quantities. They are required in trace quantities, but both are required. Just because something is required less does not mean it is unimportant. Okay. So one is the macronutrient and the other is the micronutrient. Now what happens to this? This also goes to the root. This also goes to the root. It results in the plant producing the necessary yield, be it paddy or any other crop, it's necessary yield. So far, so good. Now what happens? First, cultivation is over. Okay. Now what happens to this NPK macronutrient has decreased a little bit because the soil has its natural fertility. Micronutrient has also decreased a little bit. Do you agree? So far it's clear. Till here, no problem. The problem comes now. What we usually do is, if you look at any major fertilizer, urea or any major fertilizer, they are predominantly macronutrient based fertilizers. Okay, which means what you do, this has got reduced. Okay, this has got reduced. So you are replenishing it. You're replenishing it by, let's say, urea. I'm just giving an example, urea. So now what the soil has lost in terms of macronutrient, it gets replenished. But what happens in the case of micronutrient? It continues to get depleted. So if you look at it, just I don't intend to complicate, but if you look at it, suppose I draw the graph for macronutrient, that is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Okay. So this was the natural, and this is your time. Okay. So with a crop, it has come down. Okay, it has come down. But what are you doing? You're again trying to increase it. Let's say by putting urea. You have reached it to the required level. Then, so this is your harvest. Yeah, this is at the time of harvest. You have the lowest macronutrient. Then you have artificially increased it by using urea. Then the next cycle. Then the next. Then the next. No problem in this. No, in this there is no problem. But if you look at micronutrient, what happens? Your time. So I'll try to match here. So earlier the micronutrient was, let's say, something like this. It came down. Okay. Now the next time also it is coming down because there is no one to supplement it. So it is coming down. So by second or third, the micronutrient is completely depleted. Now when the micronutrient is completely depleted, what happens? The farmer is becoming a little desperate because he does not see the yield there. Maybe perhaps he is not technically competent enough to understand what is causing the problem. So out of desperation, what do you think a farmer who does not know the reason that micronutrient is causing the productivity loss, what will an ordinary farmer try to do? Put yourself in the farmer's shoes. What will you try to do? Any idea? Exactly. Absolutely right, Prachi. He will keep on trying to add more and more urea because he may think that, okay, so the urea is not sufficient enough. I'll keep on adding more urea. So now two problems are simultaneously coming. Problem number one is your micronutrient is completely gone. Your soil is completely depleted. That itself is a problem. Yeah. The second problem is not diagnosing the problem itself properly. As a farmer, what I do, I keep on adding more urea. Now, the loss of micronutrient has caused the first problem, what I call as soil nutrient imbalance. As Prachi said, adding of more urea causes the second problem, which is eutrophication. Now, we all have studied eutrophication in detail, so I'm not explaining it. Yeah, so it will be on the soil surface, soil can only absorb so much, water will come, there will be a surface runoff, and when there is a surface runoff, it is going to go and fall into the nearest water body, causing eutrophication. But then, when it is going to rain, some amount of excessive fertilizer will also percolate down health issues due to groundwater contamination. Yeah, I hope if this part of explanation is clear. Now, if we see the text part, it will all be a smooth flow for us. So now let's see what we have written in the slides. Excessive use of fertilizers. Why is fertilizers required? So this point we have discussed. Excessive, why is fertilizer required? Repeated crop cultivation, natural nutrient depletion, applying chemical fertilizer. However, excessive use has the following problems. Widespread imbalance in soil nutrient. Okay, so widespread imbalance in soil nutrient, this is what we have discussed. Plants to absorb more micronutrients from soil, soil becomes deficient in micronutrients. So far so good. Yeah, the micronutrient comes down, the farmer panics, he keeps on adding more macronutrient. It has absolutely no impact on the yield. The yield continues to fall, but it causes a further problem of eutrophication of water bodies. That is through surface runoff. So when the groundwater percolates down, so these urea are all nitrogen-based. Sorry, one second. The urea is a nitrate-based fertilizer. So when nitrate can dissolve in water, it will go and it will reach the groundwater. So when it reaches the groundwater, contamination of nitrate in the groundwater is known to cause health issues, specifically among infants, bottle-fed infants, known as methemoglobinemia. Yeah, so this is the disease, methemoglobinemia, also known as blue baby syndrome. Blue because generally babies are supposed to be pinkish, no? Pinkish or reddish. Slightly pinch their cheeks, it's kind of reddish. But blue is an indication that there is a problem with the blood itself, as in pale. You understand the meaning of pale, no? Pale or blue skin. So this is the symptom. And lethargic eyes. So the baby appears tired all the time. Okay, so that's perhaps an indication that the baby is having there is perhaps nitrate contamination in the water body. Okay, so what we have done, we have just completed the first part, which is 1A. We have completed. Now, if I come to 1B, excessive use of plant protection chemicals. So the same issue. I apply pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicide, all the sides I apply. Okay. Now, has anyone looked at what could be a usual disadvantage of excessive use of plant protection chemicals? Excessive use. Can someone tell me anything that you have come across? Means you have used an excess of pesticides. Okay. What are all the disadvantages? Logically, not even from an environment side. Use your common sense and see what could happen. Okay, resistance among the pest, you mean, Abhishek? Yeah, it could increase the resistance among the pests and the insects. Yeah, harming other useful organisms. Very good. Harming non-target or actually useful organisms. For example, so there is this thing called nematocide. Nematodes. Do you understand what are nematodes? Yeah. So in order to specifically kill them, there is nematocides. But when nematocides are applied, sometimes it kills organisms like earthworm, because technically that also comes under the category of nematode or somewhat close to that. Now the problem is that it harming other useful organisms, which is problematic. Second, it will increase the resistance to the pest. So Abhishek, if I were to ask you, since it is, yeah, absolutely right, Anand. It ultimately enters the food chain. I'm coming to that. Now coming back to Abhishek, since you're saying it increases the virulence of the pest or the insecticide, as a farmer, what will the farmer do logically? He sees that they are not getting killed. What will he logically do? Yeah, add more in the sense either he will spray more or he will increase the concentration. It will increase the concentration. Now, I don't know if you're aware, there have been this is a little more than 2-3 years old, but the news is still fresh in my memory. So when the farmers were using pesticides, they usually spray, they spray the pesticides. There was this one crop, I'm sorry if I'm getting the name wrong, but it was one variety of cotton where they had used genetically modified cotton. Okay. Now, it so happens that the normal cotton at a crop level, cotton can grow quite tall, but at a crop level, it was about 4 feet. So the farmer used to apply pesticide where, are you able to understand? His gun will be directed down. The gun will be directed down. But in this case, when a new version of BT cotton or genetically modified cotton had come, he had to spray it like this. Are you able to understand? He had to spray it, means at 45-degree above. Apparently, the crops were taller than this. This resulted in something which he had not anticipated. When he was spraying it down, he could escape the harmful emissions. Yeah, farmers lose eye. Yeah, you're right, Anand. I'm talking of the same case. Farmers lost eye. They also lost lives. Also, they died. Many of them, because I was a little shocked when I heard how a simple thing can cause so much of a problem. Coming back to it, so this BT cotton, it grew a little taller, and when they sprayed, can you imagine? The aerosol goes and it will descend. So when it descends on the farmer himself, and he is under so much pressure to finish the pesticide that he does not realize it. But in the process, he ends up inhaling a lot of them. And one symptom is that what Anand has mentioned is about the farmer losing eye in case of moderate impact. In case of severe impact, they lost their lives. And the loss was very painful because it impacted their nervous system. And if I remember it correctly, some of them had to be tied to the bed. You understand? They had to be tied to the bed. Why? Because they were having violent seizures. You understand? Seizures, fits. Yeah, they were having violent seizures. So how a small thing about excessive, yeah. So when they went back and did a root cause analysis, one of the things they found, why this all ties down to what Abhishek said about resistance of the pest. Because the pests were becoming more and more resistant, the farmers was becoming a little desperate and knowing very well, they increase the concentration. It's very clearly written in the pesticide bottle or in the market that not use it beyond the concentration level. But they were least bothered because they were feeling that if I use in the same concentration this season also, I'll get the same result that I got in the previous season, which is very low crops. So in an attempt to improve the crop productivity, he unfortunately ended up ending his own life. So he didn't know that, but that's what happened. So I think some of the points that you guys have mentioned is right. So with that, yeah, enter into the food chain. Now the same thing. The pesticide has fallen on the crops. Let's say paddy. The paddy is eaten by us directly. In some cases, there is grazing of some of the farm animals. Now the human being eats these farm animals. Then there is already one level of magnification at the farm animal, and there is a second level of magnification at the human being. So it enters the food chain, and what is happening now? What is the principle that is happening? The principle that is happening here is biomagnification. Yeah. So pest resistance we have covered, health issues we have covered, biomagnification we have covered. So it's very interesting that the land degradation major reason seems to be intensive agriculture. It's very somewhat surprising when you initially think, because at least my generation, we have been raised praising green revolution, and rightly so, because in 60s India was in badly need of that kind of agriculture revolution, because you may have read in your economics, 60s was a very bad decade for India. 1962 we lost China war, 1965 we had Indo-Pak war, and 66, 67 we had 2 or 3 rounds of drought in India, and many people died. So we had to badly do something, which was, we welcomed the concept of green revolution, which increased the productivity and the overall production. But at that time, we could not anticipate the long-term consequences of intensive irrigation. Okay, good. So with this, we complete the use of agrochemicals. Let me just see the slides also, in case it missed something. Excessive use, collateral damage. This, so this Prachi has mentioned, biocides tend to remain concentration. So this Anand has mentioned, gradual increase in immunity. So Abhishek, you mentioned. So all 3 points have been mentioned by you guys. Let's come to the next one, excessive irrigation. In fact, this is an answer given by many of you in the last class itself, over irrigation, water logging. So excessive irrigation is good. There are some crops which are highly irrigation intensive. Yeah. Can you think of any crops which is highly irrigation intensive? Means you give them tons of water and highly irrigation intensive. Yeah, superb. Rice and sugarcane both. Yeah, rice and sugarcane both. Yeah, it is estimated that around 60% of India's irrigation goes to just these 2 plants. Imagine rice and sugarcane. Yeah, so there are some plants which require a high amount of water, but the problem is, once the soil is waterlogged soil. Once the soil is waterlogged, the roots of the soil do not get oxygen. Sometimes it's a little surprising. We thought plants do photosynthesis, right? Why do they need oxygen? Plants do photosynthesis, but that is that part of the plant which is above the land. So it is the leaves, chlorophyll, sunlight, carbon dioxide. But the roots need oxygen. Okay. Now, if it is waterlogged, what is water going to do? It is going to displace all oxygen. It's going to be all water. So eventually, it will result in the death of the plant. And if it is, if it has some productive capacity, due to continuous waterlogging, the productive capacity will come down. Now, once the productive capacity comes down, what do I call that land? I call that as a degraded land. Salt affectation. So this is salinity, as some of you had mentioned in the previous classes also. So salinity, you could say, is happens in a combination of 2 factors. A, there needs to be high temperature. B, there needs to be excessive irrigation. Now, what will happen? Imagine there is a standing crop. It is irrigated. There is good amount of water, but water will have some salts, whatever source you take it from, be it tube well, river or pond. It will have some dissolved salts. Now there is a crop. Yeah, there is water. There is water. Now, as long as there is sun, the water will evaporate. The water will evaporate. But what happens to the salt? The salt will deposit. Salt will firmly get deposited on the ground. Then once again, the land is irrigated, water, evaporation, second layer of salt formation. So over few cycles, the top layer of the land has an excess concentration of salt. So salinity results in degradation of land. Okay. So we look broadly at two factors. One is the use of agrochemicals like both fertilizers and pesticides. Other is excessive irrigation, which has two sub problems. Problem A is waterlogging. Problem B is salt affectation. Now, the last part of this flow chart, what was the last part of this flow chart? Was cultivation of high yielding varieties. Cultivation of high yielding varieties. Now, I may say that in order for me to cultivate high yielding varieties, what are the things I need to do? I need to apply fertilizer. I need to have pesticides. Yeah, I need to have continuous source of irrigation. Now, fertilizer and pesticides is covered here in 1. Excessive irrigation is covered here in 2. So, in other words, I may say that cultivation of high yielding variety causes land degradation because in order to cultivate high yielding varieties, you need to use agrochemicals plus you need to excessively irrigate. It's a simple formula. Yeah, cultivation of high yielding variety invariably involves the first 2 points of excessive use of agrochemicals and excessive irrigation. Okay. Okay. Now, how can we at least mitigate land degradation? Are there inexpensive means, eco-friendly means through which we can mitigate land degradation? We discussed the first point yesterday: shelter belt plantation. So we call this as shelter belt plantation. Yeah. Now we also, let's just look at this. So this first picture here is shelter belt plantation. Shelter belt plantation. Now you're able to see these rows of trees planted over here. Yeah. Now these have been carefully planted in this direction because the dominant wind direction is this. This is the dominant wind direction. So what do? You at least ensure that the wind speed is broken. The moment wind speed is broken, what happens? Its ability to take the soil along with it is reduced. Therefore, what happens? Soil erosion comes down. Okay, so that's the simple method of shelter belt plantation, particularly helpful in the case of wind erosion. Particularly helpful in the case of wind erosion. The second one, contour ploughing. Ploughing of fields at right angles to the slope. So let's understand this. What is the meaning of right angles to the slope? So the second one, the picture here is your contour ploughing. Contour. Okay. So if you look at it, what is the direction of the slope? The direction of the slope is like this, correct? This one, this arrow mark that I showed. Am I right? So right angle to the direction of the slope will be like this. That is why this is more counterintuitive also. You don't need this knowledge. If someone asks you to irrigate in a mountainous land, this is how you'll create the contours. No, But the scientific reason is the contours have to be perpendicular. So if I meet this, what is this angle? This angle is 90 degrees. That is why it is, I'm saying that the contours, what is contour? So which is also step cultivation. In fact, I would have mentioned it here. The term is used synonymously with step cultivation. Okay. So contour plowing is plowing of fields at right angles to the slope. So in this case, what is happening? Now let's see what happens when it rains. Just imagine this picture so that I can draw it again here. Draw it somewhere here. Suppose this is your slope. What I have done, I have cut it like this. Then I have cut it like this. Cut it like this. Okay. Now I am growing some crops here. In small crops here, crops here, crops here. It rains. So the direction of water flow is like this. Okay. So the water will come, it will fall here. Yeah. But because there is no slope here, its speed will get reduced. Its speed will get reduced. So it will go at a very, very slow speed. Then suddenly there is a drop. So here the speed will increase. Now, once again, it is flat, the speed is low. So what are you doing? What you did for a shelter belt plantation to prevent the wind speed from increasing, very similar thing you are doing for a contour plowing by ensuring that the speed of falling water is reduced. So far, so good. Now, the small modification what people make is at this point of the step. So what they do is the mountain is like this. You have cut it. You do like this, and towards the end, you create a small bund kind of a structure, and then you do small bund kind of a structure. Now, the reason why you do this is first it will try to accumulate some water, okay, and here once again it will try to reduce the speed of the water. Otherwise, what will happen? Suppose the mountain was like this, you did like this very sharp. At this point, this point, what will happen is it will become like this. Are you able to visualize it? If it is a very sharp edge, the water flow will erode there. So by doing slightly creating a micro dam or a bund here, you are once again reducing the speed of the water. Okay. So what we are seeing is in both example 1 and 2, the method is to reduce the speed of the agent of erosion, which is wind in case 1 and water in case 2. Okay. Let's look at the third way in which you can prevent land degradation: strip farming. Strip farming, sometimes used interchangeably with the term polyvarietal cultivation. So in case someone says polyvarietal cultivation is what? Decode the term polyvarietal. Okay, so multiple varieties of cultivation. Now, when that multiple variety of cultivation is done in neat strips in a large land, it is called as strip farming. So the picture of strip farming is something like this. So here in this one, you are seeing 3 crops: corn, oats, and hay. Yeah, HAY, hay. Now, corn, oats, and hay, why they do strip farming? Because at no point in time is your field completely barren. Yeah, either 2 crops. Best situation is all 3 crops are present because the growing season. Worst case, you plan it in such a way that at least 1 crop is present. That is the simple logic. Now, by doing that, what are you doing? You are once again stopping the wind from picking up speed, therefore reducing its erosional capacity. Same with water also. You prevent water from flowing at a fast pace. You break the speed of the water. So all the 3 eco-friendly means that I have mentioned here is specifically with respect to preventing soil erosion and therefore preventing land degradation. Okay, you might kind of go back and say we will do afforestation. Does it help in land degradation? Of course it does. You can say that we will take measures for avoiding water logging. Will it help in improvement of the land condition? Of course it does. So you can just reverse and say all the things that needs to be done so that land degradation can be reversed. Okay. Yeah. So this is a current affairs thing about ISRO coming up with desertification and land degradation access for India. Sometimes it helps to know some of these various departments of ISRO. Space Application Center. Yeah. Space Application Center, any idea which city it is? So this atlas has been prepared, released by them, which is one of the departments of ISRO. Which city or which state at least? It's a good guess, Prachi. ISRO headquarters is in Bangalore. Yeah, Ahmedabad. It is in Ahmedabad. Space Application Center is in Ahmedabad. So but a lot of other things are in Bangalore. But do you know where is ISRO's what do you call it? I forget. The tracking center means once a satellite goes, there is a separate tracking center, and that does not happen from Bangalore. Any idea? The clue is it is in Karnataka, but not in Bangalore. You heard of this place? Let me just type the place. Hassan. Yeah, it is a command and control and tracking center. Second tracking center, I have to update, but even 2 years back they were talking of they were thinking of having a second tracking center in Bhopal. I'll check whether Bhopal is operational, but for now it is only Hassan. Okay. So let's look at the major reasons for land degradation. We have already discussed it: natural processes and anthropogenic activities. Natural processes and anthropogenic activities. In this, we have seen this waterlogging, salinity, mass movement is your landslides and all, frost heaving and frost shattering. I think these two parts we have not discussed. Anthropogenic activities, we know land use change, converting forest to agriculture, converting agriculture to industrial, mining, livestock grazing, industrial effluents. All of this can cause land degradation. So that is clear. Now let's look at so this picture that you are seeing here, frost heaving. I think in the notes I've sent yesterday, this word may not be there, but the picture is for frost heaving. So if you look at this picture carefully, just observe a little bit here. This is the ground level. Are you able to see the ground level here? You're seeing some trees also. But here, if you see, are you able to see it slightly? Means it looks as if this is the soil. Someone has pushed it from beneath like this. So it has become a little bit of a dome. The dome is not very clearly visible. That's why I'm just mentioning. Are you able to see this? There is a slight dome kind of a thing. Why there is a dome? There is a scientific explanation. The soil has moisture. We all know that. So soil has moisture. In Taiga, if not in Tundra, at least in Taiga kind of region where it is very cold during winter, the soil moisture is getting converted into ice. Are you able to see the ice beneath it? Here also, all through there is ice. So this layer, this full layer is covered with sand, but it is all ice beneath. Now imagine in a container you had water. Yeah, you had water. What you did, you placed, let's say, maybe, what should I say? Maybe a cardboard. What you did, there is a water in a container. So the water is up to this level, okay? And cardboard thickness is this. This is the cardboard thickness. You kept it in the refrigerator, okay? So I'm calling this as A, this as B, and cardboard is C, okay? Now you kept it in refrigerator, and next day morning when you open, let's say this is a plastic bottle, okay? So it will not really break. It's glass bottle, it may break. So it's a plastic bottle. What you have done is you have filled it with water, and on top of water you just placed a cardboard, okay? Now next day morning when you open it, what happens to the position of the cardboard? Any idea? Would you observe any change in the position of the cardboard? Can someone think through and let me know? Excellent. Goes up, will uplift. Absolutely. It will uplift for the simple reason that the water has now become ice. And ice means the volume is higher. So the ice will push in all directions. So because it's plastic, it will push left, right, top, all. It will also push in the top. So in that top, what has happened? The cardboard has gone up. Okay. If it is a cardboard, it's fine. What happens if you clip the cardboard here? Means the cardboard is attached here like this. Yeah. So it is likely that the cardboard will become like this. Am I right? Because these two ends are fixed. Now, what has just happened to the cardboard here is what has happened to the land here. Are you able to see the parallel? Yeah, because the land as a whole cannot lift, means it is like miles and miles away. So it will lift wherever there is a chance for it to lift. So this is called as frost heaving. Sometimes, sometimes the ice will continue to expand and it may cause a crack in the soil. It may cause a crack here. So that kind of a phenomena is called as frost shattering. Okay, so these two terms you can just know: frost heaving and frost shattering. Needless to say, once you have a frost shattering, it has kind of broke open the ground itself, so it is not very conducive to do agriculture. Frost anyway is not conducive to do agriculture. Even after the frost has gone, the land is no more what it was. There is up and down, there is crack, and all this have come. Okay. Let's look at some of the important things that this atlas tells us. Yeah, I think I would recommend. I generally am not a great fan of asking people to remember facts, but in reports or in such documents, especially done by ISRO or other important organization, it's important that you remember the facts also, and it's not very difficult. 30% of India's geographical area has been impacted. Impacted by what? Impacted by land degradation. It's a round figure, easy to remember. 30%. Okay. Almost all states have recorded an increase in degraded land. This is another big statement. Almost all states. This itself is worrisome. But what is more worrisome is the rate of increase has been maximum in the northeastern states, which are high on biodiversity. 30% of the entire India. Okay. And the other part is this atlas was released in the year 2018, and it had recorded data since 2003. Okay, so that is how you can say, have recorded an increase. Increase means what? Increase with respect to base year. So that base year was 2003 and 4. 2003-4 financial year. From there to 2018-19 financial year. Okay, so 15-year period it has noted. So for 15 years, imagine the spacecraft is looking at India. So what kind of satellite would we have used for this? Any idea? To know the land degradation, the type of satellites. We have only 2-3 type of satellites now. What kind of satellites have we used? Remote sensing. Super. We use remote sensing satellite. And in that also, I'll check, but in that also I expect you to have used a resource sat kind of a thing. Now, yeah, Earth observation, remote sensing satellite. That's right. Now, in 2019, when the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification and that conference happened in Delhi, our Prime Minister had said that we will become land degradation neutral. This is the term. Land degradation neutral by 2030. This is an important term for us to understand and remember. So what is the meaning of land degradation? Okay. So the United Nations, UNCCD, defines land degradation neutrality in the italics word that I have mentioned at the bottom of the slide. Okay. So what does it say? It says the amount and the quality. So it is looking at both the amount as an area, and the quality necessary to support ecosystem functions and services and enhance food security remains stable or increases. What does this mean? Let's look at it again. So in simple language, if I were to explain this paragraph in 2 minutes, what is it? I'll be saying that India has 32 lakh square kilometer. That's the area of India, right? So these things you should remember. 32 lakh square kilometer is area of India, which is roughly, let's say, 3.2 million square kilometers. In that, not all land can support agriculture or even biodiversity. Okay, you have, let's say, a large amount of desert landscape. You have some areas which are frost, completely cold desert like Ladakh and regions like that, which cannot support. Okay, no problem. Now, when we say India will become land degradation neutral, what it means is we will have A, sufficient area, and B, the required quality of land resources to do what? To support the ecosystem function and services. Go back, we talked about ecosystem services. What are they? charging of groundwater, keeping the temperature under control, um, um, protection of biodiversity, what else? Production of oxygen, helping in their role in nutrient cycle. So that those are all the ecosystem services. So what are we saying? We need to have enough amount of land and the right quality of land so that we can support the ecosystem function and services and enhance the food security. So that amount of land, it has to either be there at that level or it should increase. Now the question comes, how much more should India do so that it reaches land degradation neutrality? Which means you can ask it other way. See, this raises a lot of things. Now, one logical thing that comes out of this is India land degradation neutral as on date? The answer is no. Because we are saying we will become land degradation neutral. Are you broadly able to understand? As of now, if someone says, is India land degradation neutral? The answer is no, because that is our target to reach in 2030. But how far should India travel? Let's look at some of the other slides. This again comes back in a different context, so I'll explain. So we need to reclaim something like 26 million hectares, means 0.26 million square kilometers, which is approximately. So we need to reclaim 26 million hectares, which is 0.26 million kilometers square. Okay, so 0.26 divided by 3 million. So how much is it? So this is roughly 8.5%. Yeah, is it getting too much of math? I hope you're able to understand. It comes again, so I'll explain that how this boils down. Now, currently 97.85 million hectare is so and so. So try to remember it in a round figure. Currently, what are we saying? We'll remember it as 100 million hectare. Okay, so 100 million hectare. So 100 hectare is equal to 1 square kilometer. Yeah, just remember this so that it's easy for you, because newspapers will report the same thing in different measures. So it is easy for you to remember. So when I say 100 million hectare, what does it mean? It means 1 million square kilometer. And what is India's land area? 3.2 million square kilometer. So 1 divided by 3.2 is approximately 30% of India's land, which is what we are saying. Approximately 30% of its geographical area has been impacted, which we are correlating with actual fact. Okay, out of 97, 3 million hectares has got added. 3 million hectares has got added in the last 15 years alone. The last 15 years alone. It is no surprise that Rajasthan is the state with the largest percentage of degraded land, which means 1/5 of India's degraded land is in the single state of Rajasthan. But the good news about Rajasthan is, while all states have shown an increasing trend, Rajasthan has actually shown a decreasing trend. Even though it's very small, but it is still significant. You know, the state with the highest degraded area is showing a declining trend. Even though it's very minuscule, but it is still a trend worth remembering. So now Rajasthan, how should we remember? The state with 1/5 of the degraded land, but is showing a negative trend. 60% of degraded land is either rain-fed farmland, responsible for food security, or forest. Now, this is very important. Out of this 100 million hectares, we are saying 60 million hectares is either rain-fed farmland or it is forest land. So this is necessary for food security and this is necessary for climate change. So far, so good. Now, the last thing that the report says is water erosion. Erosion due to water is the most common. 80% of the degradation is due to water erosion. Now, the water erosion itself could be a function of deforestation. Yeah? It could also be a function of flash floods, cloud burst. There could be multiple reasons, but water erosion is 80% and followed by wind erosion. Salinity and water logging are the other major factors. So you can remember it predominantly it is water erosion. Yeah. So let's spend some time on this atlas. So what I've done, I've taken the ISRO map as it is, okay, from the website, to compare it with. So this is your down to earth map. A somewhat similar map is given by down to earth also. The advantage of the down to earth map is that you need not understand the reason for desertification or degradation. So here it is called desertification. So you will see that degradation, desertification, they are used interchangeably because desertification is also a type of land degradation. That means it could say it's an extreme form of land degradation where the productivity is almost coming to zero. Okay, so that is why it is called as almost 30% of India is under desertification. You could say that almost 30% of India's land is degraded or severely degraded. Yeah, it's okay. Wherever you see that it is being interchangeably used, the 30% is a true for you. Now, if you look at this left-hand side picture, so the darker the color, more the degraded the land. So this does not come as a surprise to us. Yeah. How you can correlate with the ISRO map is this is due to wind erosion. So this map says okay, this is due to wind erosion. Got it. Now here I see another dark patch here. So this is a barren, rocky, stony waste. Yeah, barren, rocky, stony waste. So technically, this is actually the LAC runs somewhere here. So it is that part of India. Okay. Now I see so what is the next range of colors I see? Next brown I see maybe somewhere here. This again is not very difficult to understand because this is also by the way, you have the bunny grassland also here, but barring that, you do have a lot of wastelands in this region. This region is showing thick brown. Any idea? Next, what could be the cause for degradation in this area? Almost entire of Jharkhand, I would say almost 75% of Jharkhand is shown in dark brown. Maybe not as brown as this, but it is considerably brown, right? Sounds interesting, is it not? Excellent, guys. Mining. Very good. Mining is the right answer. Yeah, mining, and based on the mining, you are having the steel plants and all that. Perfect. Now, what I want you guys to know, because I have tried and I did not get the answer. So please try to figure out. My guess is, yeah, Sundarban black is not an indication of desertification, Bhavna. I saw this. I saw both of them are showing black. I saw both of them showing black, but black is not an indication of desertification. Okay, so don't worry on that part, both places, because otherwise they would have told it due to what? Just as they are saying water erosion, water logging, and all, they would have told. I also observed this. It's a good observation for you. Now, I want some of you guys to help me understand why would this area be a degraded land? I don't want to, kind of rush through it. But if someone can tell me, does anyone has an answer, or you want to think about it and tell me, let me know. Yeah, so it is a proper Telangana, and we are seeing that region is also showing as degraded. And when I look at the ISRO map, yeah, corresponding to this, when I look at the ISRO map, it's showing light pinkish color. Are you able to see this? And the nomenclature for light pinkish color is salinization. So it is my logic. Please don't buy it right away. It is my logic, Abhishek, is that in Telangana, as in Andhra Pradesh and to some extent Tamil Nadu, you have irrigation from tube wells in a big way. Do you agree? In Deccan as a whole, but specifically Telangana, Andhra, you have tube well. I believe this could be due to low groundwater level. When you have low groundwater level, you're going deep below and you're trying to pump water out. But even when you pump water out, it has that the quality of water has a lot of problems, including possibly Abhishek. Maybe if you can just check and let me know, anyone after this class also, if you can just check and let me know. Yeah, lots of salts. So it could have a lot of salts, which makes irrigation very difficult. It makes irrigation. That's my guess, guys. I've not seen this, but I thought you guys could help me and help each other in trying to understand this. Surprisingly, this place also shows some amount of salinization, which is almost Ganga basin. It's almost a Ganga basin. So this is a good two maps that you can correlate and then understand which areas are highly degraded. Yeah, which areas are highly degraded. So wherever the Ganges is flowing, it's shown as water logging, but need not necessarily be. I mean, it can be water logging because you have a lot of sugarcane cultivation in this part of KG Basin. KG Basin, yeah, I have to check, Bhavna. To be honest, I have to check because some part of KG Basin is actually offshore. Okay, it is in the Bay of Bengal. Maybe there is some part which is inside, but I have to check. I have no idea. That's why I thought I'll ask you guys. Why don't one of you just check it and message me in WhatsApp so that I can share with the team. Share it with me along with any newspaper links if you can figure out. That's how you'll be able to remember it better. Okay. Yeah, so this is your Ganges basin, which is somewhat appears clear. It's very interesting. When I look at, hey, this is Brahmaputra. Brahmaputra also seems to be clear, which means there is no major land degradation, which is somewhat correlated by the fact I know for sure that this area, especially Silchar area in Assam, it is still the rice bowl of Assam. Here, Uttar Pradesh, no issues. Madhya Pradesh, for example, this part of Madhya Pradesh, if you see, this is the place where you have your Kanha, Panha, Pench, this, that, all the tiger reserves and biosphere reserves. So it is quite logical that this place cannot be degraded. So maybe like that you can get some small clue. This is your Godavari, rice bowl or rice basin, the East Godavari district. Therefore, it does not shown to be as being highly degraded. I am seeing the Kaveri basin in Tamil Nadu that is also shown as not being degraded. I can logically understand why, because we do have good amount of cultivation. Okay, so this sounds kind of interesting, no? That one set of facts, land degradation at least, you are having to draw some conclusions based on that. Maybe some of your existing assumptions could get challenged. Now, one of my assumptions that got challenged was, again, for this, I don't have an answer. I'm once again seeking your help. This part of Western Ghats, okay, somewhat, it is showing as degraded, but the same thing, the Karnataka part of Western Ghats and Kerala part of Western Ghats is showing as not degraded. This is also a mystery. If someone can solve, I'll be really thankful to you guys. It will be a good exercise for you also. Just figure out. That's what I say. It will challenge some of the assumptions that we had. Okay? Good. Okay, sticking with land degradation. Another current affairs. So in June this year, our Prime Minister had delivered a keynote address, which was a UN high-level dialogue on desertification, land degradation, and drought. So some of the things that he has stated, these are all facts that he has stated. In the last year, around 3 million hectares of forest land cover added in India, adding up to almost 25%. So if you look at 25%, this once again, this is how you should keep on thinking. We studied Indian State of Forest Report 2021. Do you remember 2021? There also, if you remember, I said there is a forest cover and a tree cover. So if you add both of it, it was coming almost to 25%. This correlates it. That's what the Prime Minister is also saying. Yeah. Then it will be a nice revision and integration with the Indian State of Forest Report. And he says what? 3 million hectares. So once again, so they're saying 3 million hectares, which is not a very big amount. You see, it is only 0.3 million square kilometers. 0.3 million square kilometers, and India's land is how much? 3 million square kilometers, which means 1%. Nothing wrong. Even if you're able to recover 1% of the forest land, it is still worth. Means 1% of the forest land means what? 1% of the total area of India has been made as forest, which is not bad, right? 3 million hectares. That's what it adds up to. Then India is on its track to achieve the national commitment on land degradation neutrality. Yeah, this is what I was mentioning. 26 million hectares of degraded land aimed to be achieved by 2030. 26 million. That's quite a steep target, because in the last 10 years we have done 3 million. From 3 million, we are directly coming to 26 million. 9 times. It's a leap of faith. Yeah, it's a leap. You know, I think we should have steep targets. You know, that's how we grow as a person and as a nation. So restoration of 26 million hectares of degraded land by 2030, the Prime Minister is saying, this will achieve a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, where is this coming from, guys? He's talking of land degradation, but this target is not related to land degradation. Can you tell me where did you earlier see this 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon sink? That's the proof for you, carbon sink. Okay, COP26, Paris Agreement, excellent. We actually talked of it before itself, Abhishek. In Paris Agreement, if you remember, there were 3 things. No, we talked of that we will increase the renewable energy capacity by up to 40% of the energy mix will come from renewable energy. He said that what is it? GDP emission intensity will come down by 33 to 35%. The third one was about having a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons. The reason why I'm bringing this is, are you able to see how everything is so well interconnected? If they ask you a question on land degradation, you can pull something from Paris Agreement. And if you say that, additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons Paris equivalent as committed by India in Paris Agreement, then it looks impressive to be examined. Okay, great. Then he also mentioned that we have set up a center for excellence, center of excellence. Center of excellence is what? To promote scientific approach towards land degradation issues. Now, in this, it's a small, maybe a foreign policy aspect or a foreign relations aspect. This is being done not just for India, but for its developing countries, neighbors, and people who are away from India. So this phenomena where a developing country, India, we ourselves a developing country, helps another developing country, it has a name. It is called as South-South cooperation. It's called as South-South cooperation. But you may be thinking India is in the northern hemisphere. How is it called South-South? It is called South-South because it is not the geographical north. It is the economic south. What is the meaning of economic south? Economical south means developing and less developed countries. Okay. So this is about the center of excellence. The Prime Minister in his speech, he also talks about bunny grassland in the run of Kutch. We discussed bunny grassland, do you recollect? Few classes before. So he talks about bunny grassland and how restoration of land has actually had a positive impact on the people. Because of land productivity, they were able to have more maybe cattle to graze for. More cattle to graze actually meant more milk meant more income meant more economic prosperity for people in the region. So once again, bunny grassland becomes important. So go back about what 3-4 classes before we talked about bunny grassland. Yeah, once again related to biodiversity. So I just touched upon bunny grassland there. So it is time for you to, after this class, you will again go and see, okay, what are the things you studied at the bunny grassland, so that you feel better connected among the various subtopics. Okay, so that is the end of land degradation. So we've completed soil erosion, we've completed land degradation. There's a small topic on deforestation and desertification. Okay, deforestation and desertification. So let's start with deforestation. Okay. The definition is well known to us. So we all understand cutting, uprooting, repeated lopping. Lopping, you just try to find out what it is. Lopping, what they do is they just cut the tips of the branches. Cut the tip of the branch. I don't know why they do it, but that is called as lopping. Maybe it has an artistic value. Overgrazing can also cause deforestation. Trampling of seedlings. So yesterday we discussed that when seedlings, which are the future forest, yeah, if they are shifted away or moved, even that is called as deforestation. So that is a little new. So you may want to just remember this part. If the seedlings are trampled upon or if they are displaced, that is also called as deforestation. These things I think we know ourselves. So why do we need forest? So forest we need. Importance of forest, I think we know it. But let's look at the functions of forest. This is important. The functions of forest can be broadly divided as productive, protective, regulative. Productive. Productive is easy to understand. It produces. Produces what? Produces variety of things used by human beings. Fruits, timber, resins, latex, and a host of pharmaceutical products. That's your productive function. Protective functions in one simple sentence is it provides a habitat. Habitat for a variety of species of flora and fauna. So you have productive, you have protective. Then you have regulative. Regulative is the one where forest helps you to regulate the temperature, rainfall, various nutrient cycle, so on and so forth. So all these things it is able to regulate. And all forests, you remember, we saw forest role in hydrological cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, all the gaseous cycle saw that there is a role of forest. So I mentioned against each cycle what is the use. Now, how do forests help in preventing floods? So the one question I wanted to ask before we go further, no? Do forests help in preventing floods? But that itself can be a question of debate. No? How can forest help in preventing floods? So in terms of simple yes or no, do you agree that forest help in preventing floods? Yes. Yeah, you all say it is yes. So let me ask you another question. Does it help in preventing droughts? Yes, again. Okay. It helps in preventing droughts. So let's see if at all it is true, then how does it help in preventing floods and how does it help in preventing droughts? So I draw through a simple flow chart kind of a thing for us to be able to understand. So let's imagine a situation of flood caused due to heavy rainfall. Okay. So talking of heavy rainfall, it's very crazily raining in Chennai yesterday and today, and when you least expect it. All these years, I've never seen Chennai experiencing rain at this time, almost towards the New Year. Yeah, yesterday in 6 hours, the roads were all, many of the roads were flooded and we had serious traffic. Okay. So heavy rainfall. So heavy rainfall means what? So when the rain falls, yeah, on the tree, let's say, yeah. So when the rain falls, some of the water seeps in. In fact, a large amount of water seeps in. The roots are able to hold them. Roots are able to hold them. Yeah. Suppose if 100 units of water has fallen down, because the soil is porous and the roots are able to hold, what will it do? More water will be. So the water has two paths. No? Path one is this. Path two is this. This is your runoff. This is your percolation. Yeah, I'm just giving a rough figure. Let's say because there you have good amount of vegetative cover, 70% of the water percolates and there is a 30% of water that runs off. Okay. Now, because there is water and the roots are connected to the soil and the roots are going deep, the water can also go deep. Yeah, because every time the root absorbs it, more water will come in, more water will be pulled down, and more water will eventually percolate down. So, what does this mean? Less surface runoff. So, for 100 units, only 30 units is running off. Now, if there is less surface runoff, what does it mean? Of course, runoff means it will carry with it some amount of silt, but that silt, when it eventually goes into a reservoir, the silting is less. Silting is less. Yesterday we discussed on silting also, less silting of water bodies. And because there are roots, the amount of silting is also less. See here, there are two things that are happening. Please have a look at it carefully. First, because there is forest, only 30% there is a runoff, which means there is a silt, which is a small amount is getting carried. Okay. So because the roots are holding on to the soil, that will further reduce the silt getting carried. So as a result of which, what happens? Your reservoir or any tanks or any other reservoir, lakes, ponds, you have less silting. Less silting means more capacity to absorb flood waters. Okay, because less silting means the capacity of the water body is still very high. A greater capacity to hold water, therefore lesser flood in the habitable areas. So this is the forest's role in prevention of floods. Now, how about droughts? Now, in droughts, it prevents an interesting thing. In droughts, what happened? So, droughts means no rainfall, let's say. Yeah. So, we are looking at the same tree, let's say. We're looking at the same. Now, in the previous season, there was heavy rainfall. So, the roots had these moistures in them. Not just roots, the soil also has moisture. Now, this time, unfortunately, the sun is very relentless and there is no rainfall. There is no rainfall. But then, does it mean that the tree is going to die now? No. What is it doing? This is the time for it to use the water that it had absorbed or accumulated in the previous heavy monsoon season and continue to grow. That's the beauty part. So this is like, you say, save for the proverbial rainy day. So the trees and the roots have exactly done that. They have absorbed the excess amount of water during heavy rainfall days so that they could use them during the duration of droughts. Which means if you have forest, yeah, preventing floods and helping manage droughts are two sides of the same coin. Now, why do I say that? There was excessive rainfall which was used by the forest and it stored the water in it. It's almost as if this whole tree along with its root, it's almost as if it's a sponge. Sponge, what did the sponge do? The sponge absorbs during rainfall. And what is happening? The sponge squeezes itself during drought. Does this make sense? It absorbs excess more than what the land can otherwise absorb because the roots are holding on to water. So it absorbs water during rainfall and it squeezes itself to release that water during drought. And because of this reason, they are also called as natural sponges. Forests are also called as natural sponges for the reason that we have just discussed. Okay, so this is one small thought I thought I'll seed it in you so that you can, rather than just mechanically seeing the forest will help in floods and droughts, how exactly it happens. If you remember this flowchart, it will be easy for you to recollect. Causes of deforestation. I think we have discussed this in detail. Agriculture, clearing of forest land for agriculture. So this agriculture can also be broadly called as a land use change. Yeah, land use. So what you can write is land use change, example agriculture. Shifting cultivation, June farming, slash and burn method. All of this you must have studied in geography also. Parts of Northeast India. Demand for firewood in rural regions for cooking and heating, wood for industry, urbanization and development projects. Consequences. Consequences, I think you've just discussed. What happens? You will just reverse what we have discussed in the case of this. We'll just reverse it because soil erosion. So if there is no forest, loose soil, prone to erosion, silting of water bodies, floods. It's a very logical sequence. Climate change, once again, deforestation aggravates greenhouse effect. We know that laws of biodiversity, quite logical because you will have neither the flora nor the fauna that will be present in the forest in case of deforestation. So that was a very short topic on deforestation because one way or the other we have covered it in biodiversity, we have covered it in global warming, we have covered it in pollution also. So I did not see the need to have too many slides about desertification. The next topic is desertification. Desertification. So desertification, please understand one thing if you want to remember, just note that desertification is also a type of land degradation, a severe type. Yeah, desertification is a type of land degradation. That's the first point that you should write. The second point you should write is desertification can be due to both natural as well as anthropogenic reasons. So it's not that deserts have become deserts only after human beings have set foot. It was there earlier also. Yeah, the first point is desertification is a type of land degradation. The second point is desertification can be due to both natural factors as well as man-made factors. But you can add that man-made factors have accelerated the pace of desertification. Let's look at the key reasons. Achha, so U and CCV, whenever you write a definition, it always helps to quote some important body. So I've just copy pasted what U and CCV has said. It is better. I had a different definition earlier, but I removed it because U and CCV says this. So land degradation in arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid regions, resulting from various factors, including climatic variations and human activity. So pretty much it also touches upon the fact about climatic reasons and what are the key reasons for desertification? Indiscriminate cutting of trees and overgrazing. This we know for sure. Now, this is an example of soil erosion causing desertification. Excessive mining in forest areas. Excessive mining in forest areas, because when you mine it, you usually blast the surface, so you fundamentally alter the crust of the earth. Yeah. So what has taken billions of years to form, because what you do, go back to ecological succession. You can remember the map. If you can remember the picture, we started with barren rocks and a large amount of soil was formed. The forest is there. So what they do is, first they have to remove the forest as it is, deforestation is on, and they place explosives in some cases, or they dig deep. So in either case, you completely change the topography of the land. So if it has taken million years to form, it is once again going to take several hundreds or thousands of years to form, because you have not just removed the forest, you have also played with the soil structure. Because when you blast or when you drill holes which are 2-3 kilometers deep, you are fundamentally altering the topography. Okay, so that's why excessive mining is also a problem. Over exploitation of groundwater. This is an interesting cause of desertification, which may not immediately come to our mind. That how is groundwater over exploitation to desertification? So here is the sequence. When you overexploit the groundwater, there is a fall in the water table. Once there is a fall in the water table, there were two problems long back in one of the classes I have explained, if you remember. Either there could be seawater intrusion, or some of the poisonous salts, toxic salts. You remember when we talked about arsenic poisoning. Do you remember arsenic poisoning? We talked about arsenic poisoning in Jharkhand, West Bengal region. And the reason we said was the groundwater table has been depleted very, very low. As a result of which, earlier we used to take water from 50-60 feet. So the arsenic, which was contaminating the groundwater even then at 400 feet, did not matter to us, because we were not going up to 400 feet, but now we are going to 400 feet. So some amount of salts, and some of them can be harmful salts. Some of them could just make the whole water saline. So the moment you have saline water, you cannot expect to grow crops with saline water. Okay, so these are some of the key reasons. Yellow colored water. Okay. Extent of desertification. So one interesting observation that has come is 76% of the total desert area has been due to man-made desertification process. Yeah, according to an estimate. What we are saying is, of the desert area that that has happened over the last 50 years or since independence, that 76% of that increase is due to man-made activities. Okay, so that's on the desertification. Coming to desertification at a global level. Okay, so let's just maybe spend. I'll first describe what this map is. So this map has been prepared by the US Department of Agriculture, and they are calling it as desertification vulnerability. Which are the areas which are more prone to be vulnerable? More prone to be vulnerable. So if you look at vulnerability, they have various color codes. You're able to see it. The ones which are deep red, yeah, this is your highly vulnerable. This is your highly vulnerable part at a global level. Okay, and this gray color is dry or cold region. For example, this gray color is Sahara, Arabian, or somewhat Gobi, and all that. So this is your dry region. Cold, they have anyway mentioned. Yeah? Cold is mentioned here as cold. Okay. Now, I'll give you about maybe 1 minute. There are no right or wrong answers in this. Can you guys just take about 30 seconds to 1 minute, observe the atlas, and tell me what you observe in terms of this one? High desertification vulnerability. What is your observation of the areas that are shown? I'll repeat. What is your observation with respect to highly vulnerable? That is areas with high desertification vulnerability by looking at the global map. Yeah, I'll be back in 30 seconds. Let me, then we'll have a discussion. Yes, any thoughts? Any pattern that you observe? Anything at all? One second, a lot of explanations. Tropical region is more prone. Okay, these are areas adjoining existing deserts. Areas close to dry areas of higher. Excellent, excellent, beautiful. I think that is the most important observation here. One of the outcomes is if you see. Let's start with this guy. Yeah, start with this guy. One, obviously, as Anand says, it is somewhat in the tropical region, but there are a lot of red areas in the temperate also. You see this region. What is this region called? Any idea? Bhavna, since you said the answer, can you tell me what is this region of Africa called? The typical name, no? Is yeah, Sahel region, exactly. Sub-Saharan region, locally known as the Sahel region, called as the Sahel region. Now, the biggest desert here is Sahara. So it borders, which means, so this is one example. Now, if I look at this, what is this desert? This is Patagonia. Even though it's a cold desert, but it is nevertheless a desert, Patagonia. If I look at the red here, not all, but if I look at the red here, this part, yeah, you have the Mojave and the Sonoran desert. Yeah. Now, if I look at this part, are you able to see this? Most vulnerable. This is your Thar desert. I believe somewhere here would be your Arabian desert. So you see a red here. How about this one? Are you able to see this? What is this gray saying? Dry. So I'll say this is the Great Sandy Desert. Yeah. So the first observation, obviously, yeah, Great Sandy Desert. So the first observation, as Bhavna has rightly said, a couple of others have also said, that the ones which are bordering the desert are the most prone to desertification. And the logic also, you guys have got it perfectly right. Suppose I have a desert, okay, and I have some trees in the adjoining areas of the desert. Yeah. So when the wind blows, what does it do? It takes these sands and it deposits them here, 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 here in this. So tomorrow, if the wind blows in this direction, it will deposit the sands here. Now, over a period of time, if the trees are already grown up, they can withstand. Okay. But if the trees are smaller or the shrubs, and if they are shrubs, okay, what will happen is over a period of time, the desert-like characteristics start spreading in all directions with every blowing of the wind. So left to itself, here comes an important part. Left to itself, a desert will grow in size. This is a very important thing that we should remember, which means left to itself. Yeah. Have you come across a statement which starts like this in science? Left to itself, a desert grows by itself. Similarly, in science, something a very fundamental law or rule also talks. Maybe it doesn't say left to itself, but I am adding this phrase left to itself. I'm talking about the law of entropy. Left to itself, the entropy in a system increases. The disorderliness in a system increases. Okay. So this could also be called as some kind of disorderliness. Okay, good. Now, interestingly, when I looked at India, look at this, there's a small red. We definitely don't have a desert here. Okay. Now, if I correlate this map with this map, yeah, so my question is still unanswered. So 2-3 maps are saying that some part of the peninsular India, Deccan India, is not just under desertification, but is also prone to desertification. Okay. So this is something that I am looking forward for an answer from some of you. Okay, if you can help me. So you may say, but so what happens to the other red regions? By the way, so here also, so this is your Kalahari and Namib desert. Namib would come here, Kalahari means somewhat here only, Kalahari desert. There are some parts, you intermittently find a red here. This red can also be explained by Sahara, but you find a lot of red here, guys. Yeah, I've tried to figure out what is the reason, but here partly it could be desert, but partly, for example, these areas, yeah, which is if I geographically look at it, this becomes your Afghanistan and this becomes all your CIS countries. Yeah, so all these have been shown as prone to desertification. All of them have been shown as prone to desertification. Another observation also that I can draw is very rarely, if at all, the desertification vulnerability does not seem to be in the coastal area. Yeah, all of them are a little interior. Means here also, if I look at it, this is the leeway side of Rocky Mountain, no, not the windward side. This is the leeway side. Sahel, pretty much, continental type of climate. This is also on the leeway side of Andes. This is also a lot of mountain ranges here. Your Pamir Knot, this, that, all of that comes here. Somewhat here you may say, but this is also not the coastal region. Yeah, that could be another observation. The desertification vulnerability seems to be more in regions which are not coastal. Yeah. How will cold deserts grow without sand? So cold desert, the wind is cold, Bhavna. So see, when we say desert, no, it does not mean that it needs to have sand. No. So if the wind is cold, it will bring in the same kind of climatic conditions in nearby regions. But having said that, the growth of the hot desert is more anytime. Yeah, because it is the sand that grows. But cold desert by itself, because of the cold wind, will try to impose similar characteristic if there are no obstructions like a mountain range. So that's on desertification vulnerability. And a short note on UNCCD. I thought because it's the most important organization, a couple of things are important. This thing is important. It's an only international legally binding framework, okay, set up to address the problem of desertification. Till date, this is the only one that is present. And terms like when you write or when you read something, these terms you should remember. Bottom-up approach, yeah, which is the opposite of top-down approach. Which is the opposite of top-down approach. Bottom approach, whenever you talk about bottom-up approach, no, automatically this word will come. People participation. Whenever you talk of bottom-up approach, the corollary or the corresponding word that you have to use is people's participation. Okay. So other than that, this is a pretty static, I would say. This I had also added this point on land degradation neutrality, and 120 countries, including India, have committed. So bond challenge, EO and N. So this is important. So what is the bond challenge? To bring 150 million hectares of degraded and deforested landscape to restoration by 2020 and 350 million hectares by 2030. So that's quite a tall order. And India has pledged how much? 26 million hectares by 2030. Sometimes, bond challenge. There is also bond convention. Are you aware? Bond convention. What is it related to? Bond challenge is related to UNCCD. So just keep a track of it. Yeah, excellent. Migratory species, superb. Convention on conservation of migratory species. Yeah. So just sometimes the same city could be used in a different context. This is called challenge. That is called convention. Just be a little careful because in the same question you may have both the options given. The moment you see bond, you may be tending to tick the answer that you know without even looking at the other options. So just be a little careful. Yeah. Geoengineering. So this is one topic that I should have covered actually in our global warming and climate change. I just realized that it had slipped my mind. But nevertheless, we can do that now. Okay, we can do that now. I'm sure you must have heard of this term, geoengineering. Yeah, somewhere while studying, while reading a couple of topics, you must have come across, you must have heard of this term called ocean fertilization, solar geoengineering. Someone says we'll keep some giant mirrors in the space to reflect the sunlight. We will do something so that the sunlight does not come. We will reflect the sunlight and allow it to make it pass, without entering into the atmosphere, go back. So all these ideas, technologies, methodologies are collectively called as geoengineering. So what is geoengineering? It is a deliberate and a large-scale intervention in the Earth's climatic system to minimize rise in global temperature. So it is deliberate. It is also large-scale. It has to be done at a scale so that it impacts a substantial portion of the Earth's surface. So that is when you call it as geoengineering. Okay, it's also called as climate engineering. So this is more of an emerging science. And before I go a little detail or deep into it, I want to tell this to you that there is a lot of criticism for this also because we are trying to alter. We are trying to play with the Earth. Number one. Number two, by doing geoengineering, you can just remember it or note down. So the first criticism of geoengineering, which is not mentioned in the slide, that's what I'm saying. So the first criticism of geoengineering is that we are somewhat, playing with the nature. Yeah, playing with the nature because we are altering the heat budget. Yeah, so one is playing with nature. Second is we have not sufficiently understood how well this works. That is how well geoengineering works. And what are all the potential consequences or side effects of geoengineering? That is the second criticism. Yeah. Third, less of criticism but more of constraint is that they are very expensive. They're very expensive and broadly at an early stage of development. The third point is they are very expensive and at an early stage of development. And there is one more point which I forgot. Let me just think about it. We are saying we are playing with nature. One is that we are playing with nature, and second is expensive. We do not know the consequences, and I'll think about it. There's one more in case some of you come across. Also, just let me know. I forgot that part. Okay, doesn't matter. So one of the major geoengineering is what is called as solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. It's also called as solar geoengineering. So under geoengineering, we have 3 categories. The first category is called solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. Now, what is it that we are going to do in this? As the name suggests, radiation management. We are going to do radiation management. So radiation management means what? We just work on one aspect. We are working to increase the planetary albedo or reflectivity. We are working to increase the, it's not still developed. Yeah, maybe that is, there is one more point I forgot about, but I'll just think about it. Okay. So in solar radiation management, we are mainly talking about how to increase the Earth's albedo reflectivity so that less of solar radiation comes and more is reflected. Because at the crux of it, what is at the crux of it? So if I have the sun, and I have the Earth's atmosphere. So this is the Earth. Okay, this is the Earth and this is the Earth atmosphere. So the solar radiation comes, then you have the clouds and all. The clouds absorb it. If I can do something that more light is reflected back into the space and less comes to the Earth, then that is the funda of solar radiation management. Okay. Yeah. So criticism. Thanks. Now I remember. So the fourth and the most important criticism, what people say, no, if we are able to invest in geoengineering, it may dilute the commitment of the countries to reduce global warming in the long term. This is the most important thing I forgot. So I repeat, we have mentioned 3 criticisms. The fourth criticism of geoengineering is if geoengineering indeed turns out to be promising, see, because it's a temporary measure, right? It's not a permanent measure like deforestation at all. It's a temporary measure because you have to keep on doing it and it involves a lot of expenditure. If there is more emphasis on geoengineering, if there is more emphasis on geoengineering, it will dilute the country's commitment to reduce global warming on a long-term basis. That is the fourth one. Yeah, good, I remembered it. So those are the 4 criticisms of geoengineering. Now let's look at solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. So in that there are 3 sub-parts. But all of them, what is common? All of them, they aim to increase the albedo. Simple. Okay, so now mentally you can be clear. Okay, so this is what they're trying to do. So what is it? What is the first one? Stratospheric aerosol injection. Aerosol. We all understand aerosol, no? Liquid or gaseous, very, very minute liquid particles which are almost like vapor form. So what do? You inject the gas in the stratosphere. So directly at a very height, means let's say 10 or even more than 15 kilometers height, you will inject. Okay. So inject a gas which then converts to aerosol. Now this causes a phenomenon called as global dimming. Global dimming. And among all the methods of solar radiation management, the stratospheric aerosol injection is the one which is the most researched method. I am not saying, IPCC itself says it. IPCC calls the stratospheric aerosol injection method as the most researched method of solar geoengineering. So what do we do in stratospheric aerosol injection? It is something like this. So you are connecting a balloon to a ship and there is a tube, means it is connected by a very, very, very minute tube and it is actually connected. Okay. So wherever the ship goes, it guides the balloon along with it. It guides the balloon along with it. So they have just zoomed this. So you're able to see this. There's a small hole in this. There's a hollow hole. You're able to continuously inject gas here. The gas travels up to this height And by the time it goes, for whatever may be the reason, because the pressure is less, the temperature is less, so the gas becomes an aerosol. Now, if this travels substantial distance, you can see that the balloon has been coming from this direction. Yeah, it has been spraying the aerosol. So wherever it has been spraying the aerosol, what is happening to the sunlight? The sun comes, which would have majority of it would have otherwise come here, but now some part is getting reflected back. Some part is getting reflected back. So this is called as the stratospheric aerosol injection. Instead of aerosol, okay, if certain sea salts are sprayed into what are called as marine clouds, yeah, marine clouds, which once again makes them more reflective. So the same funda, but a different name called as marine cloud brightening. Marine cloud brightening. So that also has the principle of increase in albedo. And the third principle is called as cirrus cloud thinning. So in geography, if you have seen, you would have talked of various types of clouds. The most important being this cumulonimbus cloud, one which really looks scary also, from 2 kilometers up to 12 kilometers it goes. The cumulonimbus cloud. One form of cloud important from a heat budget is the cirrus cloud. Why cirrus cloud is important from heat budget? Because it has the maximum ability to absorb the infrared radiation. Okay, so if you are once again able to remove the particles. So whenever we say cloud thinning, how does a cloud form? The cloud is formed as a result of dust particle or other small particles which act as the nuclei. So around this dust particle, the water vapors will start forming. Sorry. Yeah. So when sufficient water vapors have formed, that is nothing but the cloud. So in cirrus cloud thinning, what you do is through technology, through some means, you try to remove the nuclei itself. So when you try to remove more and more nuclei, less water vapor is formed. If less water vapor is formed, less heat absorption capacity. Okay. Once again, what you do, less heat absorption capacity means the sunlight will come, it won't get absorbed. So majority of it gets reflected back. So all these three categories come under solar geoengineering, and all of them have the simple funda of increasing the reflectivity of the clouds, increasing the reflectivity of clouds, either artificial. So in that also, if I were to look, this is actually an artificial cloud created, right? That is the difference between the first one and this one. This is a natural cloud. In that you are making some change, but here there is no cloud. You are creating the cloud. Yeah. But what is common in all three? In all three, you are making sure that the albedo is increased. Okay. So that's one form. Yeah, ground-based albedo. So far we have talked about solar-based albedo. Ground-based albedo may things like whitening the roof, change of albedo at a larger scale means you're trying to improve the glacier cover, so on and so forth. Okay, which means make it white as much as possible. Yeah, at a ground level. So you did it at a cloud level here. You are doing the same thing at a ground level here. Okay, so that is one kind of geoengineering. What is the second kind of geoengineering? The second kind of geoengineering is called ocean fertilization or ocean nourishment. Now, ocean nourishment is what, as the name suggests, nourishment. Nourishment means increase the nutrient supply. Where? To the upper ocean. So if I increase the nutrient supply to upper ocean, what does it do? It increases the biological production. So what is the biological production? I have phytoplankton, somewhat similar to your eutrophication, but done in the ocean. So I have phytoplankton. So if I have more phytoplankton, what am I able to do? I am able to make sure that more amount of carbon is getting captured from the atmosphere, which in other words, CO2 is getting used by the ocean and converted into mass of phytoplankton. Okay, so in this a lot of research has been done, but iron fertilization. So people have experimented with iron, urea, and phosphorus, and usually the result has been that the iron fertilization has produced the best result. Means whenever ions of iron have been injected into the water, it has been found that it it spurs the growth of phytoplankton, and therefore ion fertilization is a common type of ocean fertilization. Okay, so that's the second part. It will reflect sunlight, yes, and hence it is called global dimming. You are right, Bhavna. It's called global dimming. Actually, global dimming also brings me to, since you asked this question, it reminds me. This aerosol effect, what it says, this is being inspired by volcanoes. That's why this volcano picture is also mentioned here. So whenever there is a massive volcano, for example, in the 19th century, I think some 1887 or 83, there was this powerful blast of Krakatoa. Have you heard of Krakatoa volcano? Which country Krakatoa? Can someone tell me? Malaysia, somewhat close, I think, or am I wrong? I could also be wrong. Somewhat close to Malaysia, that country is. Krakatoa is Indonesia. Yeah, but Sumatra is Indonesia. Yeah, that's right. So Krakatoa is Indonesia. So Indonesia, this blast happened, and this is just an example. And the smoke, it throws up to 10-12 kilometers into the atmosphere, which means it directly goes and you have the gaseous and solid particles settling at the stratosphere. Yeah, and you know what happens? If you read a documentary, I saw this documentary in National Geographic several years back. For several days or months, the sunlight could not come. It's not that it was pitch dark, but you can imagine what happened. No, there's a very thick cloud cover kind of a thing, and the sun rays could not come. So that part of the world experienced a phase of few weeks where they could not see the sun. Okay. Now a similar thing in a totally unrelated context, I'm saying, how many of you have heard this concept called? Have you come across this term? Nuclear winter. Oh, someone has already responded. Oh, you come across nuclear winter. Why am I bringing nuclear winter here? Can anyone tell me? So the same funda. Just as a volcano, yeah, just as a volcano blasts here, the nuclear, whenever there is a nuclear blast, imagine there is a nuclear blast, what happens? The mushroom cloud, it goes up in the air and it forms a layer on top of the stratosphere, and it can be there for several days together, so much so that it will prevent sunlight from coming in at all. When it prevents sunlight from coming in, there is a marked decrease in the temperature in that region, so much so that it is called as nuclear winter. Okay, so I would say that this aerosol method is, though inspired from this volcanic eruption, it is somewhat also similar to nuclear winter. Okay. So we looked at solar radiation modification, we looked at ocean fertilization. The third one is geosequestration. So carbon sequestration, when done in the land, we call it as geosequestration. Okay. So now what is geosequestration? It has some 2-3 simple steps. Step 1 is capturing carbon dioxide. Okay, so where are you capturing carbon dioxide? From major sources like power plants. Now you could either capture it from gas or a coal-based power plant, one that produces carbon dioxide. So first is capturing carbon dioxide. Then what is the second step? Transporting that carbon dioxide by a pipeline. That is the second step. And what is the third step? Injecting it into a suitable geological formation. So 3 steps. Capture the carbon dioxide at the source, transport it, and pump it or inject it at a destination. Now tell me one thing, carbon dioxide is a gas, no? How do you think you can transport carbon dioxide? Is it possible to transport carbon dioxide, and if so, under what condition? Can someone tell me? It's an open-ended question. How do you transport? Freeze it, okay, good, you're somewhat moving in the right direction. But if something is frozen, it becomes solid, no, Prachi? Yeah, that's the right answer. High pressure, liquefy it. Absolutely. Liquefy it. So you can liquefy a gas under two conditions. Either high pressure or Abhishek has said high pressure. That is one condition. Is there any other condition where you can liquefy? Low temperature. Absolutely. High pressure or low temperature. One of the thing you have to use it. That is what they use in sequestration also. So let's discuss that. What you do is once the carbon dioxide is captured, it is compressed to a pressure of 100 bar. 100 bar is same as 100 atmospheric pressure. Yeah, 100 atmosphere, which means 100 times the current pressure. At that pressure, it becomes a fluid. Once it becomes a fluid, it is pumpable. Yeah, a fluid is pumpable, whereas a gas is not pumpable. And you can have easy transportation via pipeline. And via pipeline, where do you actually inject it? You inject it in certain areas where you're sure you're not going to use it. So one place where it is injected is depleted oil and gas reserves. Second one is saline formation. Third one is unminable coal beds. So the picture will make it a little clear. Yeah. So if you look at it, yeah, if you look at it here. So this is your power plant. Yeah. So the power plant is throwing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So you have a mechanism. Let's not worry what mechanism it is. You capture it. Yeah, you capture it. You capture this carbon dioxide here. By the way, in this picture, they are also showing a mechanism where you can pump the carbon dioxide containing carbon dioxide eating bacteria. So there are some bacteria which consume carbon dioxide, but that's a very expensive process, huh? And it's a biological process, so you're not sure what's going to happen also. So in this case, what you're doing, the carbon dioxide is pumped. Where is it pumped? It is pumped to these depleted reservoirs, yeah, depleted gas reservoirs or unminable coal beds, yeah, unminable coal beds. A natural process of, so this is an artificial sequestration, but we know that in nature also the carbon is easily captured. How is it captured? It is captured in the form of forests. Okay, so that's your geoengineering, in which we looked at three major types, which is solar radiation management, ocean fertilization, and geosequestration. Okay, I think I won't be able to do justice if I take sustainable development now. So sustainable development, we will take it on next Wednesday. So I should be able to complete sustainable development in one class. I may require half a class more. And I also intend to do some of the previous year questions also. I think it will make a lot of sense to do some questions. We will not be able to answer all of the questions. Let me tell that right away. But at least together, let's try to approach some of the prelims questions, so that because environment plays an important role in prelims. So that's on the on the class itself. I was